speaker really is going to be addressing Florida's rural areas. You know, when I grew up in Dade City, as I said earlier, and it's 2/3 of our state, I enjoy the inside of our state more so than I even do the beaches, and my wife loves the beaches. But I really do enjoy the canoe trips up and down a place like Fish-Eating Creek down in the southern part of our state leading into Okeechobee. When you get into the wilderness of our state, there's something about it that you just can't find anywhere else. And you know, we all know that we've got the great crystal clear springs and the lush farmland, and Florida's rural counties also offer close proximity to strategic business resources, a wealth of business opportunities, and outstanding quality of life, and plenty of available land. According to Enterprise Florida, these areas are hardly rural, given that each is no further, and this is really unique, than an hour away from a major airport or college. This region of Florida is also home to some of the best small towns in the United States. To present on Florida's rural competitiveness, we have Victor Leotta. Victor founded Leo LLC in 2008 to bring a technology-based approach to site selection and economic development. Victor works with clients to build economic development strategies, to win more projects, and create sustainable quality jobs. On the site selection front, Victor has worked with both international companies and local businesses to find optimal locations for commercial and industrial projects, combining advanced mapping technology with conventional land development principles. Please welcome to the stage Victor Leotta.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to be back in Florida. I've had several trips in Orlando working with a lot of folks here with the state and power companies and all on our program for creating a strategic site inventory. I'm happy to be here, but my kids aren't. I have a daughter, 9 and 10. They're pretty put out with FEDC, to be honest with you, because they learned Daddy was going back to Orlando. Yay, we're getting to go to Disney World, except they're in Vacation Bible School this week, and FEDC didn't check their schedule before they started to schedule the program. So, but we'll be back hopefully sometime soon. I would like to say, let's see, where's the clicker? Advance. Yep, here we go. All right. I didn't get the tutorial. I'm supposed to be a technology guy, so I guess let's see. All right. First, I would like to say a big word of thanks. None of what we had started here in Florida for a strategic site inventory program, developing product, would be possible without the efforts of both Duke Energy and Florida Power and Light. Our program was initially funded through a Duke Foundation grant, which enabled us to get started. And of course, Florida Power and Light very quickly joined the effort to contribute funding as well. And then Enterprise Florida has been very much a partner in the process in providing a lot of coordination effort, outreach, and all with the communities. But very much thanks to both Mark Hohenstein and Lynn Pitts for really being the early adopters of what we are doing here to bring a strategic competitive advantage to the communities through our SSI program. And we look forward to continuing to work at the regional and county level and continue to engage and work with Enterprise Florida to advance the program through its various facets. And ultimately the idea, and my presentation really is the focus when we talk about competition. All roads for competition and economic development today are leading to quality sites, and that's really what a lot of this is about. So I want to, just as an overview, and I've got a lot of slides. I'm going to move through this really quickly. A lot of it is certainly because of the experience, the collective experience and talent and economic development here today, understand a lot of these principles and these concepts. But I'm going to really lead into and finish with more of what our strategic sites inventory program is about and how that is, again, driving competitiveness for projects. Talk a little bit about the case for why it's important investment. A lot of things that Grace Swope alluded to and talked about really are a great segue into this presentation and reinforcement with the fact that the investment that needs to be made in product development and infrastructure and all that helps to build those quality inventories that you need to be competitive and compete for quality projects. the location drivers, how economic development for what companies are looking at that are ultimately going to maximize their bottom line. You know, how, if we're going to expand or relocate, where are we going to go, and how are we going to look in terms of our financial performance based on that location? What's driving that? Elements of competitive economic development. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the rural advantages and challenges specifically. And then with respect to best practices, I don't have the expertise to go into best practices in any detail. I just look at it from really kind of the top upper 80% of the common sense component and what I do see from what other successful EDOs are doing, and why it's important, I think, to continue to reinforce and make those investments to be successful. And of course, I'll close again with the Strategic Sites Inventory Program. We've all heard and I think experienced that the South really, in the southeastern part of the United States, really weathered the recession so much better than the rest of the country. And I think the recovery process, regardless of where you think it really is or not, is giving us a much faster road to recovery than elsewhere. A lot of the energy production, certainly in Texas and Louisiana, where you have the abundance of natural gas, the availability, the pricing that's driving energy production projects and manufacturing. But we're seeing throughout the Southeast a great increase in the number of project investments. And we don't really listen a lot to economists and what they report and predict. We really look at what are your major corporations doing. They're people that are a whole lot smarter. If not smarter, they're a lot more accountable, basically to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. And if these guys are confident, if they're looking at the need to begin to expand their business, then they know something about global demand, and ultimately that the risk-benefit, the factors are all there to drive that. So that's really what we're watching, and you're seeing it. I mean, the volume of inquiries for RFI responses over the last 5 years, I think is really, you see a spike in that, and the ability to respond to that, I think is increasingly more challenging to be competitive. So with the increase and the successes, we're losing inventory. So communities that have been developed, quality sites, a lot of those sites are, for a good reason, they're being developed, and you're winning projects and creating jobs. But again, you're depleting inventories. And if you still have appreciable land and you still have the opportunity to create and expand tax base, are you doing enough to continue to replenish those inventories? Quality. So whether it's certified sites programs or otherwise, we see, and I have some examples of really a lot of issues with quality of sites. So quantity is not the issue. The problem is that we're seeing sites that really not only would not make the final cut, but sites that get presented to prospects, whether via site consultant or directly from the EDO, that not only not make the cut, but they really diminish a lot of your credibility for even producing such a site. But nonetheless, those we hope to try to mitigate through an improved process through the Strategic Site Inventory, or SSI, program. I think that the location drivers, in particular with respect to real estate, are changing, and that's also the lending itself to others that have invested in the idea of preparedness, infrastructure, readiness. Developing sites is creating a new sense of competition within economic development. So when we look at location drivers in the past, all these things basically are inherent. I know there's some other factors in economics and forces that play into this, but you had to have access to market. You needed to have access to your raw materials, your inputs, labor. I mean, the idea of cost and quality of labor, certainly very important, and is. Transportation cost. What does the regulatory environment look like? How amenable is the community and the governmental policy now towards regulatory and compliance, not just environmental, but just doing business? What does that look like? Electricity rates, tax incentives. Well, in the end, you have what is real estate. And I've heard more than one very well-respected site consultant say things in the past 10 years or so, that real estate was really kind of the last piece of the equation. I mean, if you satisfy everything geographically and all your conditions from an economic component, and you look at transportation and market act, if all these things are present, you've got good labor, the cost, we'll find the site. And I think if you look at today, basically everything is the same. The difference is that the dirt's going to the top of the list. And a big reason for that is that land values, we talk about diminishing your inventory. So when sites are being moved into production or development, and it's not just with respect to economic development. So the residential expansion, of course, Florida has this in a blessing and a curse in a lot of different respects depending on where you are. And so a lot of your more valuable land, the highest and best use of which may have been economic development, industrial, commercial, but it wasn't necessarily planned that way, and so residential development has come in and taken that away. So you're losing land because of supply and demand, simple economics, and just because there's never really, I don't think there's ever been much of a bad investment in real estate by and large. If you buy a piece of property and sit on it, it's almost always going to increase in value. And so land prices are going up. So becoming cost prohibitive, the lack of the quality issues, all those metrics, those drivers are still there, but the sites themselves, that product that you have to sell your community once you attract a candidate is so vitally important today to truly be competitive. So economic development, and I've learned from working for so many different EDOs and different community organizations at the state level with the utilities, the local chambers, regional groups, that, there's so many different moving pieces and parts to economic development. There's so many facets to this profession. And I don't think people have a real appreciation of what it takes to be successful in economic development, how much really you have to invest. And from an organizational perspective, there's not one person, no matter what your accolades, your business acumen, your experiences are, that can do all of this. So competitiveness, when we talk about, yes, you have to have sites, but then you've got to have an organization in place to do all the other things for having sites enough to matter. Understanding about business and economics and finance and getting into nitty-gritty on what pilot studies are about for pilots and also in bonding capacities. You look at understanding the growth trends, migration patterns, demographics, labor, the complexion of the labor shed, and getting into, with respect to just pure site selection in of itself. Site selection can be kind of a separate discipline in and apart from just economic development. Talk about business recruiting and development, and marketing. That's a big component of being visible. Government affairs, technology resources, environmental regulatory compliance, engineering, communication, all of these things, not one person can be an expert, but you need to have some working knowledge of each of these different facets in order to be successful. And I think it's very important as you build programs to understand and bring, which very well, I think successful organizations have built teams with staff and with partners and others to do a lot of this. The idea of really trying to strengthen the resources you have as an EDO, because in the end, what we want to do is to provide the resources necessary that has the quality of the sites that you need to be successful, but at the same time, you have things in place that are going to make you or give you the ability to attract the right types of quality projects that are going to create the quality jobs that are sustainable. And doing that through strategic planning, and then also with respect to looking at target industries. We do work with a lot of communities that, quite frankly, haven't dug deep enough to really look at who it makes the most sense to target based on a matching of what their assets and infrastructure look like and their labor and ultimately sites, and then get a sense of where their best chances for success are and what does that look like. And even to get from there very specific down to the point of naming companies, a list of companies by name that become very specific market targets to go after. And then a marketing plan so that you have the visibility and the exposure that you need beyond your investment. We talk a lot about creation of a strategic sites inventory, but there's a very important investment component that I look at as an activation of the investment in strategic sites, which is your marketing component. So you've got to be visible and do it in a way that's effective, that sells the right message for the community and gets to those targets that are very specific for your community. And then within the EDO, it can get very, very deep in terms of things you need as an organization to be successful, starting with the leadership and someone who understands all the nuances. And they may not necessarily be an expert in all the facets of economic development. They can't be expected to, but to have an appreciation of the depth that it takes to be involved in economic development and site selection and what that means, and then build that organization around it with the resources necessary to do this. And even the most adept, and the reason that I have this is that EDOs that are very well funded and they have great leadership, they're doing all the right things, but if they don't have the product, and then you hear a lot about product development, that really and truly is what it's about. And I think that's why it becomes such a reoccurring theme that we hear a lot about with respect to developing strategic sites, because ultimately the most accomplished EDO in terms of all these other facets aren't going to be as successful as they could if they don't have the good quality dirt to go along to sell. So there's some opportunities in challenges. Obviously, we talk about rural economic development. We've had the opportunity and really the enjoyment to work with a lot of the counties here in Florida and some regional EDOs through what is happening with the Strategic Sites Inventory Program is with Duke and FPL laying the foundation, and we're looking at some of the larger industrial type sites that are going to be larger in acreage. They're going to create a higher amount of CapEx and jobs, and then ultimately those will be hopefully pushed to market that the communities can then market in conjunction with the power companies. But while they're doing a great service there, we have to get more specific. And so communities are looking at, well, what makes sense economically for us? Maybe heavy industrial is something that just doesn't fit here. We want to look at some commercial applications, logistics, business park, agribusiness, tech. And so we can take and building on that foundation and create different land use models to help get a better sense of what makes sense for that particular county. Within a region, even county to county, it's very much different. And of course, you have acreage prescriptions or sizes that go with that. So while on the front end of our program, we're looking at typically 150, 200 acres and above, we can find some very good sites locally that may be 50 to 100 acres or even 25 acres for certain types of applications. So when we've been working with the regional and the counties around the state as the product of the initial work from the power company with Duke and FPL to do this. And so what we're finding is rural economic development is a totally different approach and a whole different set of circumstances that you're dealing with in more urbanized and developed municipal areas. The challenges that we see in terms of infrastructure and maybe not having the connectivity that you need. You can have great sites and great opportunities with labor and maybe some of the other resources. But water, sewer, gas, electric, the catch-22 in industrial is we don't want to impact large populations and as a industrial operation, but we need water, sewer, and gas and electric. But you don't build water, sewer, and gas, electric where you don't have high populations of people. So that always becomes a problem. Labor can be an issue. Community resistance. We've worked with a lot of communities that have a lot of resistance to growth and change. That happens everywhere, but we see it a lot more in rural communities a lot of times. Education can be an issue, utility capacity, fire protection, things like that that just weigh on the fact of trying to attract a major prospect. Some of these same items show up on the list of advantages. Of course, right off the bat, availability of land. That's a huge advantage in rural economic development. The cost of land we see, by and large, can be less. And then when we talk about rural and competition, so competing industries, you can become the employer of choice. When you're attracting a large-scale employer to come in and you don't have another large-scale employer necessarily in that same labor shed, and the ability to recruit and attract, because now when you're locating that quality wage-paying job, you may be bringing in employment from the surrounding areas and can be very beneficial to that particular prospect to know that that labor is there. Environmental permitting, we see when areas that have attainment issues, or at least the aggregate of all the industry that's creating a larger permit with permitting burden and environmental can also be less of an issue in rural settings. Fewer cultural impacts. Education, I had it on a challenge list, but you know what, in some respects, we're seeing that a lot of the quality of education, especially in public schools, is much better in rural areas. County to county, I know that's different, but sometimes it is an advantage, and there's numbers there to back that up. Capacity, because even though utilities may be scarce, where you do have utilities, a lot of times, wastewater treatment, for example, may have the capacity because there's less taxing on that from the surrounding population. Zoning sometimes is not much of as big of an issue. As we see, logistics can be very favorable in the sense that when you have certain manufacturing distribution operations either getting materials in or getting them out, you have clean shots right to the interstate or to rail, and that's an advantage as well. And then, of course, cost of living and quality of life. I think in seeing a lot of the parts of the state that I'm from in Louisiana, and then also in and around, I mean, I don't live in Baton Rouge. I couldn't be paid to live in Baton Rouge, let alone New Orleans. I love to visit there, but I'm out in the outskirts because that's where I like to be. But I think that there's another advantage when you think about that, and to be able to sell your community and the benefits to a prospect and to their employees to understand what that looks like from a rural perspective. So I mentioned about best practice. I mean, somebody could conduct a whole day-long seminar on best practices, but and that's not me. I just look at it as you need to have a strategy. You got to have a plan. Just to say that, hey, we've got sites, or hey, we have some resources and we want to get in the game, but really have a well thought out plan that helps you understand more specifically about what your strengths are, your weaknesses are. Study and learn your competition. Understand who you're competing with. Understand what the markets are doing, who's moving, who's expanding. All these things lend themselves into having a very good plan that you can use to then build your team around and have some direction. Preparing your own backyard. And I look at that as, again, for product development with respect to sites. So you have a great plan, you got a good idea of who exactly that you're best suited to try to attract. But if you don't have the product when they get there, it really doesn't end well, because not only you may not miss or not make the cut on that RFI, again, you can lose some credibility with a site consultant or with the industry because you put something in front of them that was really less than ideal, and to the point in some cases being just really a very poor site. And a lot of times we get communities that aren't looking at their sites through the prism of competition. They only see their sites, and they think that they're great until they begin to look outside of their neighboring areas and see what's being developed and begin to understand how much better those sites are equipped and how much less liability those sites have than what they're currently marketing. And then surgically defining your targets. I mean, I'm talking getting very specific, going from the larger market and segments and down to understanding specifically who are the companies that you would like to go after and what makes sense, and prepare something specific for those companies as opposed to a general, hey, we're a great community with great assets and great people. Get something very specific to those particular manufacturers or those companies that you're looking to attract, whether it be in tech or agribusiness, manufacturing or assembly. And then the plan, so it's a marketing component of this, and being visible and having the ability to bring in those folks in, and ultimately the capacity to execute. That's the organizational component to this, to be able to make good on all the investment that you've made to be successful. So again, I said all roads kind of lead into strategic or to quality sites. When you look at the different applications that we have, we're looking at heavy and light industrial. Again, I mentioned in Duke and FPL's part about the initial strategic sites inventory program is focused really on a heavy and industrial and light industrial application. I will say this, heavy industrial rather, has a different connotation. It's got a different definition, a different set of criteria, absolutely from Louisiana and Florida, but even within Florida, you have different regions of the state, and that tends to mean something a little bit different. Hence why, again, we're trying to customize so that we're going to hit the bullseye in what those definitions look like to define the industries that fall into these concentrations. But commercial, agribusiness, business park, R&D tech, a lot of things that we can apply at the local level to look for sites that fall into those land uses. This is an example. I'm going to run a little bit through the mechanics. This is a much condensed version. The actual SSI presentation that we've given collectively around, I think, 5 or 6 workshops now is really at least the full 45 minutes of this to go through the mechanics of it. But I just want to provide some of the visual and the idea of how it works and why it's so important and why it's making such a difference, I think, in redefining competition locally for economic development. So this represents, if you look at the darker blue areas along this color-coded map here, what you're seeing is this is a suitability composite index, as we call it, that happens to represent a commercial model. What it's doing is it's a proximity analysis, things you want to stay near, things you would like to be near, things you'd like to stay away from, whether they be transportation, utility infrastructure, and of course you're trying to avoid flood risk, elevation issues, slope, flood-prone wetlands, other ecological and environmental issues. And so the idea is that we smash all these things together and create these composite modeling outputs that give us a very tight target area to begin to do searches for potential sites. To give you a visual context of how these things change, the models with just few tweaks to the criteria that define each of these models, which is a component of not only the siting criteria that go into them, but there's distance values that you have that you prefer, both for and against, and then there's weightings associated with each one, so you get the right amount of influence in the model output. But with slight tweaks to those formulas, if you will, you get a very different output for an industrial, a light industrial, and a commercial suitability composite. So this will give you, and of course, obviously at this scale, this doesn't get you the sense of where or actually down to individual tracks. But this gives you a visual sense of how these models change from what we've done in Florida based on changes from transportation scenarios that are associated with these models. So we have a port-dependent, interstate-dependent heavy industrial model, and that also has another version that relies more on 4-lane divided highway, where maybe you don't have direct interstate, but you've got good connectivity back up to an interchange, and so that would get a particular county in the game if that particular prospect is okay with and can work with a 4-lane divided or multi-lane divided highway. The SIS system, the strategic intermodal system roads in Florida are a tremendous asset that most states do not have. And that provides great transportation connectivity that we utilized in this modeling process and gave a very high weighting to for that very reason. So again, how we're getting from this modeling exercise, which is really just an economization of the process. We're trying to eliminate 85% of the geography, and that's what we're doing. We're eliminating areas that we know programmatically through the process won't work. That gives us sweet spots to drill in and really begin to search and identify sites that have potential. So as you drill down, you get a sense of the granularity, and again, the darker areas become our sweet spots. We have to look at individual tracts of land. We always shoot for a single tract, but more often than not, we have to assemble parcels to make a site. And how does that translate it in ultimately to a site that has merit, or potential at least, to be further evaluated through a due diligence process? Right now, this is just the identification or discovery phase in a desktop exercise. So what we're seeing is I mentioned about certified sites. This is not certified sites by any means. We're looking at something on a more robust or rigorous screening process, and ultimately whether you choose to certify sites at the end of this or not would be up to each individual community. But what we're trying to mitigate is what you see on the screen. We've seen lots of certified sites that have been wrought with fatal flaws, deal killers, that sites, and when I talk about losing merit or credibility with prospects, you present sites that have these issues. And ultimately, not only do you not make the cut, they wonder why you would, if you think this is a good site, we're not dealing with the right community. But having transportation access, for example, sometimes you have great transportation access, but nobody really looked at it. You've got interstate, you got multi-lane highway, and you've got class 1 rail, right? But the problem is that they're all right there together. So you have no separation, and the cost to get rail in and over to the site is $70, $90 million. I mean, so that becomes a major issue. Obviously, with issues with wetlands and threatened or endangered species, every site out there has some issue. There's no perfect site, but we would at least want to quantify it, dig into it, learn and understand it enough to speak to whether or not it can be mitigated, and begin to put some kind of a dollar figure associated with the cost of mitigation of these issues, whether they're environmental issues or engineering issues. But nonetheless, again, we're trying to mitigate this through our screening process to find sites that have much less of these issues. Here's a few examples of sites that have been submitted for projects that really have some issues here. This is a great industrial site, 2,800 acres with nav water frontage and some good rail access, but because there was no collaboration with planning and zoning, somebody thought it'd be a great idea to put a high school right there. Okay, bye. I mean, if you do the economic impact associated with having lost this particular site, and in this parish in Louisiana, Donaldsonville there, it's all residential, but to the west, to the east is industrial land use. But something culturally that's important is that that's okay because they welcome, in St. James and Ascension Parish, the industrial manufacturing. This is their job. This is what Grandpa did, what Mom, Dad did, what I'm going to do. So, but this was a very poor decision. Another site that long configured, but it was okay because they needed to have access to natural gas, and the configuration of the actual footprint of the construction was okay. And they had great access to natural gas. Okay, but it's in the middle of the site. Well, you're not going to move a large diameter natural gas pipeline for a project that's only a $20 million investment. Well, again, very poor planning on the part, but this site was pushed to the front for a particular response. Here's another site where they needed to have an anchorage location or a dock facility, and they had a co-location opportunity that was great, and the site met all the facets for the criteria, except after the site made it to the final cut, they discovered in front of the prospect that there's a federal no anchorage dredge zone, okay? That's when you talk about losing credibility. They've spent untold hours and trips, okay? And then this springs up at the last minute because somebody decided locally that they got wind of this and ended up talking to the river pilots. I mean, forget the Corps of Engineers. The river pilots, the ones that navigate that river every day, and it's an absolute closed, cartel of a system, they're the ones that know where you can and cannot navigate and what's happening, and nobody thought to talk to them. Another site, this was being highly marketed, high and dry, except turns out most of the site's wetlands, but this is really the kicker. They have next door a permitted hazardous waste disposal facility. It's not on site, And they argued that we got a letter of no further action from EPA and DEQ. But, I mean, again, PRP, all kinds of issues. Unless this is the last piece of dirt on the planet, why do you want to locate next to something with the groundwater flowing from that site onto your site? But they were very proud of it. Again, this particular community did not look at this through the prism of competition. One last site, pretty good separation. Gas is out of the way, but it's available. Interstate interchange, relatively high and dry. But we have, which came up last of the process, very late, active oil and gas wells on the site. The blessing and the curse with energy production and horizontal drilling and all this kind of good stuff is great, but what's happening is the mailbox money mentality of a lot of rural landowners in particular are looking at now they don't have to be on unit. They can be off unit and get in the game and be part of a lease. And so there's reluctance on the part to give up, even though you retain surface rights, and this is becoming a real challenge in trying to provide sites that are good quality with not a lot of hindrances. Okay, so, and then we get into different, schedules, if you will, for size, depending on what the land use would look like. And then ultimately, we want to screen the sites, and this is the last component. This is the 4 big deal killers that we really look at. So yeah, we do have to assemble parcels, but you can't have 15 parcels and God knows how many landowners because of the fact that there's a misperception a lot of times that a single tract means one owner. It's not necessarily the case, so we want to minimize that. And it can work, but it can be very onerous. Infrastructure, not only about having the infrastructure, but I mentioned about configuration. That can be a real challenge if the configuration is just right to be wrong. So not only with transportation for truck and rail and all, but also with utility access. Cultural, there's things that we want to look at to make sure that they've not been overlooked, that we want to be very sensitive. There's a balance in all of this. We're trying to meet the operational needs of a company. But at the same time, we've got to have some preservation, some stewardship to strike that balance between cultural, community, and environmental stewardship protection as well. And then, of course, wetlands, and I thought Louisiana was wet. Florida's wetter than Louisiana. There's not only just the wetlands themselves, but just water features, and that becomes a very big issue. Now, does that mean you can't continue to build through the wetlands process? No, because you can mitigate, but we understand quality and extent. What are you really up against? And that's something that becomes less and less, I see, in terms of the details. Yes, the site has some wetlands, but we know we can mitigate. Well, what does that mean? What's the mitigation banking cost look like? What's the availability of credits? All those things will help to formulate a more intelligent response to a prospect with respect to a particular site. And then we get into the different things that we look at when we begin to screen the sites. Finally, these are not part of our modeling process because this becomes very local. We have to then match up sites with labor shed. Just because you have the greatest piece of dirt on the earth, it doesn't help you if you can't serve labor to it. So, of course, that's a very big component to this. And then just a few little slides just to show you some examples of some of the analysis that goes along with this. We're looking at demographics and looking at growth patterns and migration trends. What's that really mean, and how does it affect workforce and labor? We're looking at trying to assess and drive time and break down the complexion of labor by the categories that make sense for those types of operations. We're doing analyses along to where you can put docks and not put docks and things like that along nav water facilities. What's the environmental burden, permitting burden look like based on the initial or the existing emitters in a particular area? All this just means more intelligence. And when it's more intelligence in a larger context of information in conjunction with that, you have a much better chance of making the right impression on a prospect as well as a site consultant. And so this is really what this is all about, everything from elevation, flood inundation, so forth and so on. So in the end, and what we did through this process is we identified in the lower Mississippi some 96 potential sites. In Louisiana, when we first started this process, that were 750 acres and above, single tracts that scored at least a 7 out of a 10, 7.5 out of a 10 for a heavy industrial operation, of which many of these sites have moved through the process and actually have become on the, in the inventory now because they have survived the subsequent processes of landowner engagement to get options on the property, which is very important, and then environmental and engineering due diligence. So we'll get to the ultimate purpose. Again, right size. We want a complement of sites for strategic sites. Relatively encumbered. We want to know about and quantify challenges. And again, that option is very important. And then finally, where we are to close, where we are to date. So we've identified in excess of 200 sites for both Duke and FP&L, and we're not entirely finished yet with those studies. It encompasses, I believe, 44 counties, 23, right, Mark? And we started with 19, and Lynn added another 5 counties to the mix. So we're getting a very good coverage within the state already. And these sites are in various stages of review, working with communities at the regional and at the county level to help prioritize, really get some local knowledge about those sites with the hopes and purpose of moving those sites to the next stages of development. The end game being, again, a highly scrutinized site of great quality that goes into an inventory ready for market to give you something to sell and something to give you a very strong competitive advantage to attract and land projects.